What you're about to witness is perhaps one of the most satisfying comebacks in modern diplomatic history. Picture this: a room full of billionaire investors, polished marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and the intoxicating scent of power and money. In walks a quiet African president, Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. The West and elite smile condescendingly, crack jokes about charity cases, and deliver what they think is a final word on his country's future. But what they don't know is that this man has been 3 steps ahead of them all along. What unfolds next will make you question everything you thought you knew about power, respect, and who really holds the cards in today's world. By the end of this story, those same investors who laughed at him will be standing in the blazing African sun, desperately begging for just 5 minutes of his time. But will he give it to them? Let's find out. A CEO looked Traoré in the eyes, smiled, and said, "Burkina Faso isn't mature enough for serious investments." That smile didn't last long. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine streets of Geneva as black sedans lined up outside the Palais des Nations. Inside the gleaming conference center, the world's financial elite gathered for what they call the African Opportunity Summit. Though the condescending undertones in their conversations suggested they viewed it more as a charity auction than a legitimate business gathering. The conference room itself was a monument to Western power. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Geneva, Italian marble floors that reflected the morning light, and a massive oval table carved from a single piece of Brazilian rosewood. Around this table sat some of the most influential figures in global finance. Men and women whose decisions could reshape entire economies with a single phone call. Jean-Luc Moreau, the silver-haired CEO of Artemis Capital, adjusted his Hermes tie as he reviewed his notes. His investment firm controlled over $847 billion in assets, and he had personally orchestrated deals that had transformed nations. Today, he expected nothing more than another opportunity to expand his empire into what he privately referred to as emerging charity cases. At exactly 9:30 a.m., the doors opened and Ibrahim Traoré entered the room. Unlike the other attendees in their $1,000 suits and designer watches, Traoré wore a simple but elegant traditional African shirt, his presence commanding attention not through ostentation, but through an indefinable dignity that seemed to fill the space around him. The other investors barely looked up from their phones and tablets. To them, he was just another African leader with his hand out, another opportunity to negotiate terms that would benefit their portfolios while offering the bare minimum in return. "Gentlemen, ladies," announced the conference moderator, "we're pleased to welcome President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso to discuss investment opportunities in his nation." Polite applause rippled through the room, the kind of perfunctory acknowledgement reserved for formalities before the real business began. Traoré stood at the head of the table, his hands clasped calmly behind his back. "Thank you for this opportunity," he began, his voice steady and measured. "Burkina Faso stands at a crossroads. We have abundant natural resources, a young and educated population, and a strategic location that could serve as a gateway to West African markets. We're not here to ask for charity. We're here to offer partnership." Margaret Whitfield, the CEO of Sterling Global Investments, barely glanced up from her tablet. "Mr. President," she said with a tone one might use to address a child, "we appreciate your optimism, but let's be realistic about risk assessment and infrastructure limitations." "Indeed," chimed in Klaus Hoffmann from Deutsche Financial Group, his German accent thick with dismissal. "The regulatory framework in most African nations simply doesn't provide the security our investors require. We're talking about hundreds of millions in capital deployment." But it was Jean-Luc Moreau who delivered the blow that would echo through the months to come. He leaned back in his leather chair, a smug smile playing at the corners of his mouth as he interlocked his fingers across his chest. "Mr. President," Moreau said, his voice dripping with false courtesy, "I truly admire your vision. I really do. The passion is certainly there, but let's be brutally honest here. Burkina Faso simply isn't mature enough for serious investment. We're not in the business of charity, and frankly, your country lacks the institutional sophistication that serious capital requires." The words hung in the air like a blade. Around the table, other investors nodded in agreement, some barely suppressing chuckles. The room's energy shifted, the predatory atmosphere of a pack sensing weakness. "Perhaps," suggested another investor. "We could discuss some smaller-scale agricultural projects, something more appropriate to your current capacity." Laughter rippled across the room, not loud, but unmistakable, the kind of laughter that stays with you, that burns in your memory long after the moment has passed. Truies' expression didn't change. His dark eyes moved slowly around the table, taking in each face, each smirk, each dismissive gesture. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds. Then something remarkable happened. Truies smiled, not the bitter smile of someone who had been insulted, not the forced smile of diplomatic politeness, but a genuine, almost mysterious smile that seemed to suggest he knew something they didn't. "Thank you," he said simply, "for your honesty." He gathered his single folder from the table, a stark contrast of mountains of documents and electronic devices surrounding the other attendees, and stood with unhurried grace. "I believe we have nothing further to discuss." The investors exchanged glances. This wasn't how these meetings typically ended. Usually, there would be negotiations, desperate appeals, promises of reform and compliance. The African leaders were supposed to fight for scraps, to beg for consideration, but Truies was already walking toward the door. "Mr. President," Morrow called out, suddenly uncertain, "surely we can continue this conversation, perhaps over dinner." Truies paused at the threshold but didn't turn around. "Mr. Morrow," he said quietly, "you've made your position quite clear. I respect that. I hope you'll extend the same courtesy to my decisions." The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving the room in stunned silence. Margaret Whitfield was the first to break the quiet. "Well, that was dramatic." "Typical," scoffed Klaus Hoffman. "They never want to hear the truth about their limitations." Jean-Luc Morrow stared at the closed door, a strange unease settling in his chest. Something about Truies' composure, his complete lack of desperation or anger, felt wrong. In his 30-year career, he had never seen an African leader walk away from a potential investment meeting without a fight. "Should we be concerned?" asked Margaret. Morrow shook his head, pushing away the uncomfortable feeling. Concern about what? He just walked away from the best deal his country could have hoped for. "If anything, we should feel sorry for the people of Burkina Faso." The meeting continued without Truies, the investors moving on to discuss other opportunities, other nations they could shape according to their preferences. By lunch, most had forgotten about the quiet president who had refused to play by their rules. But 3 days earlier, 2,400 miles away in Ouagadougou, a very different kind of meeting had been taking place. The presidential palace of Burkina Faso was not the gleaming monument to power that Western leaders might expect. It was functional, dignified, and reflected the practical approach of a leader more concerned with results and appearances. In a secure conference room on the 3rd floor, Ibrahim Traoré sat across from 2 of his most trusted advisors and a woman whose presence would have shocked the Geneva investors. Dr. Amara Okafor was a founder and CEO of Sahel Innovation Network, a Pan-African technology consortium that had quietly been revolutionizing infrastructure development across the continent. Her company had built solar grids in Nigeria, established fiber optic networks in Ghana, and created mobile banking systems that had brought millions of previously unbanked Africans into the formal economy. Operation IOTA is ready for implementation, Dr. Okafor said, sliding a tablet across the table to Truies. "We have confirmed partnerships with fintech groups in Nairobi, AG Tech cooperatives in Accra, solar energy innovators in Cape Town, and manufacturing collectives in Lagos. The total investment commitment is $2.3 billion over 5 years." Truies studied the screen, scrolling through partnership agreements, technology transfer protocols, and employment projections. Unlike the Western proposals that typically demand a majority ownership and profit repatriation, these African partnerships were structured around equity sharing, knowledge transfer, and long-term collaborative development. "The timing," he asked. 48 hours after your Geneva meeting," replied his chief of staff, Samuel Ouedraogo. "The moment you walk out of that room, we initiate phase 1. By the time their news cycle picks up the story, we'll have already secured the African Development Bank designation and begun construction on the first projects." Dr. Okafor leaned forward. "Mr. President, I won't lie to you. This is a gamble. We're betting that African solutions can succeed where Western models have failed. We're betting that our people can build the future without begging for permission. Traoré set down the tablet and looked around the room. These were people who had dedicated their lives to African development, who had seen potential that Western investors consistently underestimated or dismissed. It's not a gamble, he said quietly. It's a certainty. They see Africa as a market to be exploited. We see Africa as a home to be built. He picked up a stylus and tapped twice on the tablet screen, digitally signing the partnership agreements that would reshape his nation's future. Initiate Operation Iota. As the meeting concluded, Traoré walked his office window and gazed out at the bustling streets of Ouagadougou. Children walked to school along newly paved roads. Market vendors sold goods under modern covered stalls, and construction cranes dotted the skyline as the city grew and modernized. These were his people, his responsibility, and he had just committed to a path that would either vindicate his faith in African potential or leave his nation isolated from global capital markets. The risk was enormous. The potential reward was even greater. Meanwhile, back in Geneva, Jean-Luc Marr was enjoying a leisurely dinner at his favorite restaurant overlooking Lake Geneva. The lights of the city reflected off the water like diamonds, and the evening air carried the scent of money and success that defined his entire adult life. His phone buzzed with a text from his personal assistant. African Development Bank announcement scheduled for tomorrow. Might want to monitor. Morrow barely glanced at the message. African Development Bank announcements were typically routine affairs. Another infrastructure project, another partnership agreement, another unrealistic development timeline that would quietly disappear from the news cycle within weeks. He had no idea that his dismissive treatment of Ibrahim Traoré was about to cost him the deal of a lifetime. The next morning, financial news networks across the globe led with the same story. African Development Bank designates Burkina Faso as regional innovation hub in unprecedented partnership agreement. The details were staggering. A $2.3 billion investment package spread across renewable energy, digital infrastructure, agricultural technology, and manufacturing. But what made the story truly remarkable wasn't just the size of the investment. It was the source. Every single partner was African. Not a single Western firm was involved in what was being called the largest intra-African development partnership in modern history. Jean-Luc Marr was in his office at 7 a.m. when his head of African investments burst through the door without knocking. "Sir, we have a problem. A massive problem." Marr looked up from his morning briefing, annoyed at the interruption. "What kind of problem?" "Burkina Faso just announced a $2.3 billion development package, completely African-funded, and, sir, we're not part of it." The blood drained from Morrow's face as he grabbed his assistant's tablet and read the breaking news. Every major outlet was covering the story. Bloomberg, Reuters, CNN, the Financial Times, all of them focused on the same unprecedented development. Africa was no longer waiting for Western approval. "How is this possible?" Morrow whispered, more to himself than to his assistant. "Where did they get this kind of capital?" But as he read further, the answer became clear. The African partners weren't just bringing money. They were bringing expertise, technology, and a long-term vision that Western investors had consistently failed to match. While Artemis Capital and other Western firms have been focused on quarterly profits and risk mitigation, African innovators have been building the actual solutions that the continent needed. "Sir," his assistant said carefully, "there's more." The initial public reaction across Africa has been extraordinary. Social media is calling it African Renaissance 2.0. The story is trending in 12 countries. Morrow felt a cold dread settling in his stomach. In his 30-year career, he had prided himself on spotting opportunities before his competitors. He had built his fortune on being the first to recognize emerging markets, new technologies, shifting global dynamics. But this time, he had been so blinded by condescension that he had missed the biggest opportunity of his career. "Give me a meeting with President Traoré," he said quietly. "Sir, you heard me. Whatever it takes, I want a meeting with Ibrahim Traoré today." Within hours, Morrow's private jet was airborne, carrying him and his top investment team toward Ouagadougou. But as they flew south over the Mediterranean, none of them realized that their journey was already too late. In the presidential palace, Ibrahim Traoré was meeting with a team of Ethiopian cloud computing engineers who were designing the digital backbone for West Africa's first comprehensive internet infrastructure. The conference room was buzzing with technical discussions about fiber optic networks, data centers, and satellite communication systems. The network will connect every major city from Dakar to Lagos, explained Dr. Kabidi, the lead engineer. But more importantly, it will be owned and operated entirely by African entities. No foreign dependency, no external control switches. Traoré nodded, understanding the implications. Western technology companies had consistently used infrastructure control as leverage in their African partnerships. This new network would eliminate that advantage entirely. A soft knock interrupted the meeting. Samuel Wedrago entered the room and approached Traoré discreetly. "Sir," he whispered, "the Artemis Capital team has arrived. They're requesting an urgent meeting." Traoré didn't look up from the network diagram spread across the table. "Are they expected?" "No, sir. They came without an appointment." "I see." Traoré continued studying the technical specifications. "And where are they now?" "In the parking area. Sir, they appear to be waiting in their vehicles." For the first time, Traoré looked up around the table. The Ethiopian engineers were trying to hide their amusement. Word of the Geneva humiliation had already spread through African business networks, and the irony of Western investors now seeking urgent meetings was not lost on anyone. "Please inform them that I'm currently engaged in discussions with our Ethiopian partners about the future of African digital infrastructure. They're welcome to wait, of course, but I cannot provide a specific timeline." Samuel nodded and left the room. Through the conference room windows, Traoré could see the convoy of black vehicles parked in the afternoon heat. Inside those cars, some of the world's most powerful investors were experiencing something they rarely encountered: complete irrelevance. Jean-Luc Moreau sat in the back of his air-conditioned sedan, scrolling through news updates on his tablet. The Burkina Faso story was dominating business news, but more concerning were the follow-up articles already being published. African leaders praised Burkina Faso's independent development model. Ghana announces similar partnership discussions with African investors. Nigeria considers excluding Western firms from new infrastructure projects. The story was spreading, inspiring other African nations to reconsider their relationships with Western capital. Morrow was watching an entire continent slip away from traditional investment models, and he had personally triggered the catalyst. "How long have we been waiting?" he asked his assistant. 3 hours, sir." Through the tinted windows, Morrow could see local people going about their daily business. Students walking home from school, vendors selling goods in a nearby market, construction workers building what appeared to be a new shopping complex. The city looked prosperous, growing, confident. This wasn't the struggling African capital he had expected. Another hour passed, then another. Finally, a young protocol officer approached their vehicle. Morrow rolled down his window, hoping for good news. "Mr. Morrow," the officer asked politely. "Yes, that's correct. We're here to meet with President Traoré." The officer smiled with genuine courtesy. "I'm sorry, sir, but the president is currently engaged in strategic planning sessions with regional development partners. He asked me to thank you for your interest in Burkina Faso, but he's not available for unscheduled meetings today." Morrow felt his face flush. "Perhaps tomorrow. We've traveled a very long way." "Sir," the officer interrupted gently, "the president's calendar is fully committed to existing partnerships. He's asked me to inform you that Burkina Faso is now focused on working with partners who believed in our potential before the recent headlines." The words hit Morrow like a physical blow. He was being dismissed, not with anger or insult, but with the same quiet dignity that Traoré had displayed in Geneva. "Please," Morrow said, his voice betraying a desperation he rarely showed, "just 5 minutes. I can offer terms that would be very beneficial to Burkina Faso." The protocol officer's expression didn't change. "Sir, with respect, the president is no longer evaluating offers. He's implementing solutions." As the officer walked away, Morrow sat in stunned silence. Around him, his investment team exchanged uncomfortable glances. They were some of the most powerful people in global finance, accustomed to having doors opened, calls returned, meetings arranged at their convenience. But in this moment, in this parking lot in Ouagadougou, they were irrelevant. The realization was devastating. 6 months later, the transformation of Burkina Faso was undeniable. The Unity Express Railway connected 5 rural towns to urban trade centers, dramatically reducing transportation costs and expanding market access for local farmers. Solar energy corridors powered not just the capital but rural communities that had never had reliable electricity. Mobile banking penetration reached 78% of the adult population, higher than some European nations. New schools equipped with high-speed internet and modern educational technology graduated students who were immediately employable in the growing tech sector. But perhaps most significantly, the success of Operation Iota had inspired a wave of similar partnerships across Africa. Ghana launched the Kwame Innovation Initiative with Senegalese and Ivorian partners. Nigeria announced the Lagos-Kigali Development Corridor with Rwanda and Kenyan collaborators. The Western investment community watched in growing alarm as traditional models of African development were being replaced by something they had never anticipated: African solutions created by Africans for Africans. The annual World Economic Forum in Davos that year featured a panel titled "The Rise of African Sovereignty in Global Development." The main speaker was Ibrahim Traoré. The auditorium was packed beyond capacity, with overflow rooms set up to accommodate the unprecedented interest. In the audience, Jean-Luc Morrow sat quietly in the back, having bought a ticket at the last minute for what he hoped might be his final chance to connect with the man whose vision he had so catastrophically underestimated. When Traoré took the stage, the applause was immediate and sustained. But there was something different about his presence now. The quiet dignity remained, but it was accompanied by an unmistakable confidence that came from proven success. "Ladies and gentlemen," Traoré began, his voice carrying clearly throughout the packed auditorium. 18 months ago, I sat in a conference room in Geneva and was told that my country was not mature enough for serious investment. Today, Burkina Faso has achieved the highest GDP growth rate in West Africa, the fastest expansion of digital infrastructure on the continent, and the most successful renewable energy transition in our region's history. The applause was thunderous. "But I'm not here to celebrate our success," Traoré continued as the crowd quieted. "I'm here to extend an invitation. Africa is not anti-West. We are pro-Africa. We welcome partnerships with anyone who approaches us as equals, who believes in our potential, and who wants to build something lasting together." He paused, his eyes scanning the audience. However, the era of African nations competing with each other for Western approval is over. We are building our own networks, creating our own solutions, and defining our own future. Those who want to be part of that future are welcome. Those who prefer the old models of condescension and control will find themselves increasingly irrelevant. The room erupted in applause that lasted for nearly 5 minutes. When Traoré finally left the stage, he was surrounded by ministers, CEOs, and government officials from around the world, all seeking partnerships with a man who had proven that African independence was not just possible but profitable. In the back of the auditorium, Jean-Luc Morrow sat in his seat long after the crowd had dispersed. His phone buzzed with messages from his board of directors, his investment team, his media contacts. Everyone wanted to know his thoughts on Traoré's presentation, his assessment of a new African development model, his predictions for future investment opportunities. But Morrow had nothing to say. For the first time in his career, he was speechless. He had gambled everything on the assumption that African leaders would always need Western validation, Western capital, Western permission to succeed. He had been so convinced of his own importance that he had missed the most significant shift in global development since the end of colonialism. As he walked through the corridors of the World Economic Forum, past the networking sessions and deal-making meetings that had defined his professional life, Morrow realized he had become a relic of an era that was rapidly ending. Africa was rising, and it was rising without him. The story of Ibrahim Traoré and Jean-Luc Morrow became a case study in business schools around the world, taught as an example of how arrogance can blind even the most experienced professionals to transformative change. But for the people of Burkina Faso, it was something simpler and more profound. Proof that dignity, vision, and self-respect could triumph over condescension and control. They had been told they weren't mature enough for serious investment. Instead, they had proven that the world wasn't mature enough for their independence. As Traoré often said in interviews about that pivotal moment in Geneva, they expected us to beg. Instead, we chose to build. And build they did. The smile that had puzzled Jean-Luc Morrow in that Geneva conference room had been the smile of a man who knew something his critics didn't, that the future of Africa would be written by Africans, with or without Africans, with or without Western permission. By the time the Western investors realized what they had lost, it was already too late to recover. The meeting they had dismissed as insignificant had changed everything, and the man they had underestimated had changed the world. But the story doesn't end there. 3 years after the Geneva humiliation, something unprecedented happened that would cement Traoré's legacy forever. The African Union announced the creation of the Continental Development Bank, headquartered in Ouagadougou, with Ibrahim Traoré as its first chairperson. The bank's mission was simple but revolutionary: to fund African development projects using African capital, African expertise, and African leadership. The announcement sent shockwaves through Western financial circles. For decades, institutions have been controlling like development. The World Bank and International Monetary Fund had controlled development financing across Africa. Now, for the first time, an entirely African institution would compete directly with Western lenders. Jean-Luc Morrow, whose firm had lost over $400 million in potential African investments since the Burkina Faso debacle, watched the news from his office in Geneva. His hands trembled slightly as he read the press release. The Continental Development Bank was launching with $50 billion in initial capital, contributed by African governments, private investors, and diaspora communities worldwide. It was the largest development fund in African history, and every single dollar came from African sources. African sources. Sir, his assistant entered the office hesitantly, the board is asking for your assessment of the new African Development Bank. Morrow stared out his window at Lake Geneva, the same view he had enjoyed the night before Traoré's transformation became public. My knowledge assessment, he said quietly. We're witnessing the end of an era. The age of African dependence on Western capital is over. Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré stood before a gathering of African finance ministers, central bank governors, and development experts. The room buzzed with excitement as he outlined the bank's vision. For too long, Traoré said, we have accepted the narrative that African development requires Western approval. We have allowed others to determine our priorities, our timelines, our definitions of success. Today, we reclaim that authority. The applause was deafening, but Traoré raised his hand for silence. This is not about revenge against those who underestimated us. This is about responsibility to those who believe in us. Every child in every African village deserves the same opportunities as those in London, New York, or Geneva. Today, we begin building that reality. As the meeting concluded, journalists from around the world clamored for interviews. But Traoré's message was consistent. Africa was not turning its back on global partnerships, but it was ending its dependence on global permission. The success of the Continental Development Bank exceeded every projection. Within 2 years, it had funded infrastructure projects in 37 African countries, established technology transfer programs that eliminated the brain drain to Western universities, and created a Pan-African digital currency that reduced transaction costs for cross-border trade by 70%. But perhaps most significantly, it had inspired a new generation of African leaders who saw self-reliance not as isolation, but as a foundation for genuine partnership. 5 years after the Geneva meeting, Jean-Luc Morrow announced his retirement from Artemis Capital. In his farewell speech to the company he had built, he made a rare public acknowledgement of his greatest professional failure. I spent 30 years believing that success meant having others depend on you, he said. I learned too late that true success means not depending on anyone else. Ibrahim Traoré taught me that lesson, though I was too arrogant to learn it when it mattered. As for Traoré, he continued to lead Burkina Faso with the same quiet dignity that had defined his character from the beginning. But now that dignity was backed by undeniable results. His country had become a model for African development. Proof that self-respect and self-reliance could create prosperity without sacrificing sovereignty. The story of their encounter in Geneva became more than just a business case study. It became a symbol of a changing world, where old assumptions about power and dependency were being challenged by new realities of competence and confidence. Sometimes, late at night in his presidential office, Ibrahim Traoré would remember that moment when Jean-Luc Marot had smiled condescendingly and declared his country not mature enough for serious investment. But there was one final chapter to this story that would make it truly legendary. 7 years after the Geneva meeting, something extraordinary happened that no one could have predicted. The global financial crisis of 2032 hit Western markets with devastating force. Major investment firms collapsed overnight, currencies plummeted, and governments scrambled to prevent complete economic meltdown. Artemis Capital, Jean-Luc Marot's former firm, was among the hardest hit. The company that had once controlled nearly $1 trillion in assets was facing bankruptcy. Their African investments, which they had abandoned after the Traoré incident, would have been their salvation. Instead, they watched helplessly as African economies, built on the foundation of intercontinental partnerships, weathered the storm with remarkable stability. The irony was breathtaking. In Geneva, emergency meetings were held as Swiss financial institutions teetered on the edge of collapse. The same conference room where Traoré had been dismissed now hosted desperate discussions about survival strategies. In a twist that seemed too perfect to be real, the European Union reached out to the Continental Development Bank for emergency financing. The request landed on Ibrahim Traoré's desk on a Tuesday morning. As chairman of the Continental Development Bank, he had the authority to approve or deny a $200 billion stabilization loan to European financial institutions. The memo was brief but carried enormous weight. The European Union formally requests emergency financing assistance to prevent systemic collapse of member state banking systems. Terms negotiable, response urgently required. Traoré set the document down and walked to his window, looking out at the bustling streets of Ouagadougou. The city had transformed beyond recognition since that Geneva meeting. Gleaming office towers housed African tech companies that were now global leaders in fintech and renewable energy. The University of Burkina Faso had become one of Africa's premier research institutions, attracting students from around the world. The prosperity was undeniable, but more importantly, it was sustainable and self-generated. His chief of staff, Samuel Ouedraogo, entered the office with a knowing smile. "Sir, I assume you've seen the European requests." "I have," Traoré replied. "What's the consensus from the board?" "They're willing to consider it, but they want your guidance on terms. Some members are, let's say, enjoying the historical irony of the situation." Traoré chuckled softly. "And what would you advise?" "Honestly, sir, part of me wants to send them a one-line response. Europe isn't mature enough for serious financing, but I know that's not who we are." The next day, Ibrahim Traoré called a press conference that would be broadcast live across 6 continents. The global media had been following the story with fascination, recognizing the poetic justice of African institutions being asked to bail out European banks. Standing at the podium in the Continental Development Bank's headquarters, Traoré looked directly into the cameras. "Yesterday, we received a request for emergency financing from European institutions. The amount requested represents the largest cross-continental loan in modern history." Journalists leaned forward, sensing a historic moment. 7 years ago, I sat in a Geneva conference room and was told that Africa wasn't ready for serious investment. Today, Europe is asking Africa for serious financing. The world has indeed changed. He paused, letting the weight of the statement settle. The Continental Development Bank will provide the requested assistance, but with conditions that reflect our values and our vision for global partnership. First, this will be a partnership of equals with full transparency and mutual accountability. Second, a portion of the financing will be directed towards sustainable development projects that benefit both European and African communities. Third, European institutions will commit to treating African partners with the respect and dignity that should characterize all international relationships. The room erupted with questions, but Traoré raised his hand for silence. This is not about revenge or humiliation. It's about demonstrating that prosperity is not a zero-sum game. When Africa succeeds, the world benefits. When Europe struggles, we extend our hand in partnership, not in domination. The loan was approved, and its impact was immediate. European markets stabilized, jobs were saved, and a new framework for North-South economic cooperation was established. But more importantly, The psychological shift was permanent. The era of European paternalism toward Africa had officially ended. Jean-Luc Morrow, now 72 and long retired, watched Traoré's press conference from his apartment in Geneva. As the African leader spoke about partnership and mutual respect, Morrow felt tears forming his eyes. Not tears of sadness, but profound regret for opportunities lost and wisdom gained too late. He picked up his phone and did something he had never imagined he would do. He wrote a personal letter to Ibrahim Traoré. Mr. President, I doubt you remember me, but 7 years ago, I made the biggest mistake of my professional life when I dismissed your vision and your nation's potential. Watching your press conference today, I am filled with admiration. You have shown the world what true leadership looks like. You have proven that grace and strength are not contradictory, but complementary. I write not to ask for anything, but simply to acknowledge that you were right, and I was catastrophically wrong. The world is better because you chose dignity over revenge, partnership over domination. Thank you for the lesson in humanity. The letter was delivered through diplomatic channels, and to Morrow's knowledge surprise, he received a response within a week. Mr. Morrow, Traoré had written, I remember our meeting well, not because of the insult, but because of the opportunity it represented. Your words that day clarified something important for me, that we could not wait for others to believe in us before we believed in ourselves. In a strange way, your dismissal was a catalyst we needed to find our own path. I bear no more ill will toward you or anyone else who underestimated Africa's potential. We are all capable of moving on, growth, and it is never too late to choose a different path. If you are ever in Ouagadougou, you are welcome at the presidential palace. We can discuss not what was, but what might still be. The exchange became public when both men agreed to release their correspondence. It sparked a global conversation about leadership, humility, and the possibility of redemption, even in the most unlikely circumstances. The most profound impact of life on a new generation of leaders was that business schools began teaching the Traoré principle, the idea that sustainable success comes from building others rather than putting them down. The Geneva moment became shorthand for the dangers of arrogance and the power of self-confidence. Young African entrepreneurs spoke of being inspired by their Traoré's inspiration example, while Western business leaders cited his approach as a model for ethical international engagement. The story transcended economics and politics to become a parable about human dignity and the transformative power of self-respect. 10 years after that fateful Geneva meeting, Ibrahim Traoré was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his role in transforming international economic relations and demonstrating that prosperity and dignity are not mutually exclusive. In his acceptance speech in Oslo, he returned to the theme that had defined his leadership. Peace is not merely the absence of conflict, he said. Peace is the presence of justice, dignity, and mutual respect. When we treat each other as equals, when we approach each other with genuine partnership rather than condescension, we create the foundation for lasting prosperity and harmony. As he spoke, Jean-Luc Morrow watched from the audience, having traveled to Oslo specifically to witness this moment. At 75, he had become an unlikely advocate for ethical investment practices, often speaking about his encounter with Traoré as a turning point, not just in his career, but in his understanding of human dignity. After the ceremony, the two men met privately for the first time since the Geneva meeting. The conversation was brief but profound. I want you to know, Morrow said, that your example changed not just my approach to business, but my approach to life. You showed me that true strength comes from lifting others up, not putting them down. Traoré smiled, the same enigmatic smile that had puzzled Morrow a decade earlier. We all have capacity to grow, Mr. Morrow. The question is whether we choose to use our experiences to become bitter or to become better. The irony was perfect. In trying to teach Africa about maturity, the Western investors had revealed their own complete lack of it. The student had become the teacher. And the lesson was simple. Respect is earned, dignity is non-negotiable, and underestimating someone's potential is the surest way to become irrelevant to their future. What do you think? Would you have taken a meeting with those investors who had initially dismissed you? Or would you have made them wait in the heat like Traoré did? And more importantly, what lessons can we all learn from this incredible story about the empowerment of power respect, and believing in your own potential? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories about injustice and comeback victories that will restore your faith in standing up for what's right.